1 minute, everyone. Sorry. Just making it so that you should be able to... Maybe not. I feel like I'm slowly losing my Zoom skills as we move back to being more in person. But I will add it here as an attachment. So I have now put an attachment in the chat. I will also, of course, share my screen, but this is the source sheet that we'll be using today. Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Nice to be with you. Let's begin, as we always do, with the blessing for engaging in the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who commands us to engage in the study of Torah. So we are starting at the very beginning. I was just with my fourth grade class here at Browerman East and was talking to them about, I'm starting also in the beginning with them. I think I mentioned last time I was with all of you, which was a few weeks ago, that my time with the fourth graders is all about them starting to learn the real story of the Torah, and we begin at the very beginning. So we began today, and they had amazing questions, but I did begin by telling them the fact that our creation story, before we get into our creation story, is in contrast to many of the other creation stories of the same time period. So, for example, the Babylonian creation story, which I told them, not in too much detail, but enough to kind of pique their interest, the idea of Tiamat and Apsu, who were the two Babylonian gods who were first created in the Enuma Elish, and how they were, one of them represented salt water, one of them represented fresh water, and they came together, and that was kind of they started to create these other gods, their children. And they had a few generations of these children, all these different gods. But Apsu, who is the father god, was very upset and annoyed by all the noise and disastrous, ways in which these other baby gods were acting, as he was very upset at his children and wanted to destroy them. But his wife, Tiamat, did not like this idea and went to one of their grandchildren and let him know that their grandfather wanted to destroy them. And he put his grandfather into an ongoing sleep and basically killed him. And then later on, Tiamat, who remarries and wants to rebel against her children and grandchildren who now are upsetting her, is confronted by Marduk, who was one of the gods who basically created a collaboration with all the other gods, and he said, I will go and destroy Tiamat and take over as long as you make me your ultimate god who has power over everything. And they agree to that, and then he basically goes and he slays Tiamat by taking an arrow and splitting her in half, and her blood and guts are what become the earth, and then her skin is what becomes what was then later used to form humans. So the fourth graders got a kick out of that story, as you can imagine. But I told it as a way to say what's wonderful and revolutionary about our creation story as Jews is that we went in a completely different direction. Whereas many of the creation stories were about violence and power dynamics and blood and guts, our tradition took a very different approach to looking at creation and telling the story of creation. And that, if we think about it, it's the story that, even if you're not Jewish, that you know. The story of creation of the Torah is the one that has reigned supreme over all of these other ancient stories in many ways. And so today I want to talk about that a little, and I also do want us to focus on the creation of humanity and some of the interpretations and great stories that come with this idea of God's decision to create humans. So we'll look at this together. And of course, if you have questions and comments, feel free to raise your virtual hand and would love to hear your thoughts. So we will begin at the very beginning. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, the first line of the Torah itself. And if you remember, you may have learned the idea that the Torah does not begin with an aleph, interestingly enough, but it begins with a bet, which is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And the rabbis, when I was with these fourth graders, as we started to read these 3 lines, they, of course, flooded me with all kinds of questions of, well, if God was there, who created God? And when did God come? And if there was nothing there, but then God created something, why did God decide to create anything? All kinds of wonderful questions, to which I said, I have no answers to these questions. No one really does, but that they're phenomenal questions to ask, but they are also questions that scared our rabbis to some degree. And I said, well, why do you think these questions scared them? And some of them gave some really wonderful answers, but then I talked to them about the idea of this bet. And the teaching goes, as you may have heard this before, the idea that the bet is closed on top, closed to the right, and closed on the bottom. It's only open on one side, and it's open towards the rest of the beginning of Genesis and the rest of the text itself. And that was used as an explanation as to why we shouldn't be asking questions about what came before Bereshit, what is above and what's below, right? That there are limitations to what we can really understand, and that it's a dangerous process almost to go and try and figure out what came before, because as one of the students said, well, maybe the rabbis were upset because maybe there was, they didn't want to talk about what created God. And I said, well, right, because by mere fact that there is potentially some other force that created God would impact the idea of the fact that we believe in one God, right? So there's some challenges that come with trying to answer those questions and even ask those questions about what comes before Genesis in chapter 1, verse 1. So we're going to look forward. We're not going to try and answer those questions, those unanswerable questions, as wonderful as they are. And I want us to look at what I think is one of the first teachings that we find. If we have to remember, the Torah is not trying to teach us, the chronology of creation in a sense of a timeline, right? We live in a world in which we recognize science, evolution, the reality of those things, and that the Torah, therefore, is trying to probably teach us something else. This is not trying to necessarily say that the world is just created in 6 days and God rested on the 7th, right? Because then the question is, well, what, in one day God created all these things? No, but instead that, like everything in the Torah, there are lessons about how we are supposed to live our lives today, how we're supposed to understand the world around us. And I think that happens right away in verse 3. So we have, I'll just read it in English, the 1 through 3. When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Right? First, by the way, the fact that there was water that existed before anything else was even created is something to keep in mind, right? We don't usually focus on that. We usually think that the first thing that was created was light, but actually there seemed to already be something there in the void, in this chaos. There was water that seemed to already be there before water is even created later on, right? So there, and to me, this is really linked to the power of water in our tradition. If we think about the power of mikvah, the importance of mikvah, that it really is a rebirth and being born again, so to speak, that water has such a powerful significance in our tradition, and that it was there before anything else in many ways. But what stands out to me is the way in which the world is created. What is it that God does to bring about the creation of light? Anyone? I made it very easy on the sheet. Anyone? Yeah, Roy.
He speaks.
Right. So, Roy, what is the significance, or what is the lesson that the tradition is trying to teach us by the fact that the first thing that is created is done so through speech?
It represents thought.
Okay, keep going. What do you mean?
I have to think on this one.
Okay. I'll let you think. I'll let you think on thought. and Ben.
Thank you, Rabbi. He says it, and it shows the great power of speech. The spoken word can, move mountains and such.
Okay, good. So the power of words, right? As Ben was just saying, right? That there is the tradition is teaching us already in verse 3 that we have to be aware of the power of our words. right? I referenced in my Yom Kippur sermon, I think, that the passage "sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," and how that's not a Jewish. You can't really attribute that to Jews at all, because we recognize the power of words, and we have it right here that it's with words that God creates the world, and therefore we should be hyper aware of the use of language and the importance of language and the words we use, and that the words can create, and that at the same time, of course, that they can destroy as well, right? So right here in the beginning, we have this idea of the power of words. I see, Donna, you had your hand up.
I have mine up.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Are you calling on me, Miriam?
Yes, Miriam, I'm calling on you.
Okay. So we certainly affirm everything you just said, and Ben also about words. But another thing to emphasize is that that was the first thing that God spoke these words, and therefore we need to speak before we take any other action. So we need to first, like Moses, and God was so angry at Moses because he should have first spoken, but he took action first. And we do this in our society all the time. We take action, very often negative action, before we speak first to one another as one human to another.
Okay, so Miriam's interpretation is, and what the lesson she's drawing from this is, that we must sometimes speak before we act, right? And the power of recognizing the need to be able to articulate ideas before we act in certain ways. Okay, wonderful, thank you. Phyllis and Warren, and then Bruce.
Can't the light also refer to the Torah, and the Torah is words, and how important those words are?
Wonderful, yes. Especially when we think about this is not the sun and the moon necessarily. We're not really clear the kind of light that's being articulated here, right? Is this light as in the light of Torah? Is this the light of emotion, whatever it may be? So yes, and especially if we want to see that God created light with words, and the Torah itself is therefore the center, the most important words of our tradition, right? And it's the melding of these two with what God creates at the very beginning as both Torah and light and words, using words to bring those together. Bruce, and then Merle, and then Donna. Bruce, did you want to say something? No? Okay, we'll come back to you.
Here, I'm on now.
Oh, okay, great.
A comment and a question. First of all, this issue about the unity of God is a major issue in Platonic cosmology, in that Platonism posited the idea that God, the one God, the unmoved mover, if you will, actually did not create the cosmos, but a demiurge created the cosmos. So this is an idea that has permeated Western thought for millennia. And I think it's an extremely important one to address because it permeates down through history. It's been rejected by the monotheistic faith, but nevertheless it's important. The question that I have, though, is at the very beginning of this. You had translated the first verse of Genesis as when God began to create. And as you know, in the Septuagint, it is in arche, in the beginning. How grammatically do you explain the use of when God began to create? What is the justification for using that translation versus in arche?
Great. Wonderful question. There is It goes back to this idea of the word reshit itself, which is different than rishon, which it means first. And so if you look at Rashi, for example, let's see if I can even pull up Rashi for us, who kind of talks about this. Let me see. Which one is it going to be? Okay, so if you look at Proverbs, if you look at Jeremiah, the idea that there is a similar use of the word reshit, which is used as talking about the beginnings, but it's at the beginning, as Rashi says, at the beginning of the creation of heaven and earth, when the earth was without form and void. The text does not intend to point out the order of the acts of creation, to state that these, heaven and earth, were created first, for it intended to point this out. It should have written it differently, Berishonah bara et hashamayim v'et haaretz. Right? It would have used a different Hebrew word for rishon, meaning first. And for this reason, because wherever the word reshit occurs in Scripture, it is in the construct state, the way in which the word is used, as you find in Jeremiah and Deuteronomy, etc. We must translate it as though it is read at the beginning of God's creating. Right, so that is the most common explanation used, that the word rishon means first, but here it's the word reshit, so it's not necessarily about the first thing that's God is creating, but it's about the beginning of a process, and therefore when we usually translate in the beginning, that's not as. And of course, there are many different translations. You can go to many commentaries and find all kinds of translations. But that by stating in the beginning, the assumption seems to be that this is the very, very start. But when in fact, if you look at the Hebrew, and as Rashi kind of goes into, and a lot of people follow his take on this, is that it's really about a process that is occurring, but not a specific moment, and it's not necessarily about the chronology of what is created exactly first and then second. For example, if you look at the end of day one of a creation, it doesn't say on the first day, it says on one day, as opposed to the first day. I know it's not the best explanation. I hope that helps a little, Bruce. But you can go and do a lot more digging. I would start with Rashi and kind of the grammatical way in which he's looking at the word reshit as opposed to rishonah, and therefore that's why some of the translations differ and move away from the idea of in the beginning.
Okay, well, one thing, one last little question.
Yeah.
Bereshit, do you take that as being with a bet in the first? And is this a noun in construct state, or is this a gerund?
It's, I think, and I'm not a Hebrew grammatical expert, but I'm pretty sure it's a construct state.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thanks, Bruce. I feel like it was maybe Donna and then Jennifer.
Okay, I have a question after I make two comments. I like what you said about the water. We're talking about the word right now. The word, spoken word, like words are all I have to take your heart away from the beaches. I love that song. When we respond with love and kindness with our words, no matter what someone's saying or doing around us, it changes the whole paradigm of everything. Secondly, when you said about the water being here, I have a little pen. It's a water pen. Sadly, we're now worried about the water in California. But God had water first before he created anything. And we, in our mother's womb, were in water. So I want us to realize that we are to really appreciate that we are created in God's image and that we are his children. And this is really significant about what you said about the water, because I think that we were all with the Lord up there in heaven volunteering for the job before we came down. That's my opinion. So I thank you for your comments on the word and the water. I appreciate you everything.
Thanks, Donna. Jennifer.
Hey, thanks. So sorry to be late for a happy reason, being with my mom, but and Shabbat Shalom. Okay, I just wanted to contribute a couple of things I heard. One from a professor, Christina Hayes, of biblical history and all of that. She said that Bereshit, when in like the process of creating, because the idea when he was that the idea is that this was already there, that we're not starting at the beginning of creation, because God does not have a beginning or an end. So they're in the middle. Then the other comment that I heard was that what he was doing is, if this was already there, right, as God has always been there, what he's doing in Genesis, whether 1 or 2, is just is eliminating the chaos, settling it in order. So I just wanted to contribute what I'd already come across.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Yes, back to the lines of these other creation stories where chaos seemed to be the focus. What seems to be happening here is taking chaos, beginning with chaos, and then creating order amidst that chaos, right? So doing the reverse of some of these other creation stories that kind of thrive in chaos and violence. And here's a much more peaceful attempt to see the world and how the world comes together. That alone is also supposed to teach us not just about the way in which God created the world, but potentially how we are supposed to see our relationships with the world and with one another. Okay.
Sorry, one last thing. She said, and the difference was that you mentioned the creation stories. The idea that this God, our God, was a compassionate God and was involved with us from the beginning out of caring and love, and the other gods,꯫ Frivolous, vindictive, the whole thing.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so let's keep going and look at, we're continuing on. I mean, there's so much in this Torah portion. We're just scraping just a little bit of the surface, and I wanted to bring in a little bit of midrash to some of these parts. So when we get to verse 16, when God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to dominate the day and the lesser light to dominate the night and the stars, right? This is referring to the sun and the moon. Rashi has an interesting comment here. The great luminaries, they were created of equal size, but that of the moon was diminished because she complained and said, "It is impossible for 2 kings to make use of 1 crown." Right? So there's this interesting thing that Rashi is doing when he's referencing Chulin, which is the idea that this seems to also be teaching, mostly here through Rashi, this idea of domination is not the goal of the creation story, and that even just like the moon was willing to give more space to the sun during the day, and there's a nice children's story that comes out of this midrash that is basically trying to teach this idea of humility and the importance of making space for others, because the complaining of back and forth, the whole idea is the sun and the moon was complaining about being smaller than the sun, but instead the gift that the moon received was not just the moon itself, but then all the stars that lit up the night sky. So that the sun dominates by day, but that the moon is not alone at night, that instead the moon is surrounded by all the stars, whereas during the day the sun is by itself, right? So that there's a nice little teaching here about finding your own space, not just space, planetary space, right? But this idea of what does it mean to find a way to bring your own light to the world, and not necessarily in a way that's competitive with others, right? And Rashi seems to be moving towards that with his interpretation. Then we get into this next section, which is about these great sea monsters. Oh, yeah. Was there a question?
It was back to that, you just took it off.
I'll put it back on for you.
It was in the passive that the moon was diminished, not by, the moon didn't do it himself, because, it's a feminine here, complained. Yep. So God must have diminished it to show the moon humility. The moon did not diminish itself.
Right, correct. You are correct. Right, they were created of equal size, but then the moon was diminished because she complained. Right.
But she was given a special role then, too.
She was given a special role. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Susan.
Don't complain.
Don't complain, but she was, the benefactor related to women, and she got to be seen all the time, unlike the sun.
Exactly.
Only comes out in the day, and the daylight that produces it only comes out for several hours.
Yep.
Rabbi, is the word dominate, is that the translation Are there other ways to look at that word?
Hamer Shnei Gedolim, one of the greater days, the greater Hamer Gedol Lemishmelet Hayomet. Yeah, I think dominate would probably be the best word, but I'm sure I could look really quickly and see if I could find another translation, another way to translate it. It's like rule, realm, dominion. So it's will rule. I mean, I guess could be another translation. Memshala, it's like the whole idea of the ruler. So rule by day. So dominate or rule. Yeah. Okay. Let's go back to this. Okay, then we get into these great sea monsters, which are the Leviathan, the Leviathan which will come back according to some at the time of the Messiah. God created the great sea monsters and all the living creatures of every kind that creep, which the waters brought forth in swarms, and all the winged birds of every kind. And God saw that this was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fertile and increase, fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. By the way, besides humans, these are the only things that are actually blessed by God in creation, which is really interesting, that God saw all of these sea creatures and those that creep, in which the waters brought forth in swarms, and all the winged birds. And these are blessed by God with the same blessing that is given to humans soon thereafter, which is be fertile and increase, fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. However, there is a difference between this blessing and what comes right after it. I just thought that was an interesting little trivia, right? What else is blessed in creation besides humans? Man, however, besides being given the power to be fruitful and multiply, is especially told by God to be fruitful and multiply, and is conscious of his power to do so. What is merely an impersonal fact with regard to the rest of the animal creation is a conscious fact with regard to man. So whereas the world and God establishes animals and creatures to actually be fertile and increase, there is a difference between just passively doing that as a given versus the intentionality that is attached to humans' command to be fruitful and multiply. That we have been given this responsibility to fill the earth, as we find here. Now, I wanted us to focus really for the majority of our time on this important passage. We're really just only looking at Genesis 1 today. You know, you could do a whole year just on Bereshit in the first Torah portion. Of course, in the second chapter of Genesis, we have the story of Adam and Eve, and we have a different way in which humans are created. We have Adam created first and Eve created second, whereas here we have male and female created at the same time, right? And as we know in the famous Hebrew phrase, B'Tselem Elohim, right, created in the image of God. So it says here, and God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. And God created man in his image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. If you remember, God blessed the animals and the fish and the birds right before this, but didn't speak to them. Here, God actually speaks to humans and gives them this command and this blessing, right? And therefore, this is the first mitzvah of the Torah itself, which is be fertile and increase. Be fruitful and multiply, so to speak, is the first commandment of the Torah itself, and it comes right here. I think I see some hands up before we get into some of the midrashim, Jennifer, and then Sydney.
Okay, what I wondered is, okay, I happened to catch Jurassic Park on TV the other night, and the original, and I said, oh, I should watch this. Okay, anyway, and nobody tells a story like Steven Spielberg. No. Okay, so, but not that I watch much TV. what I wondered is be fruitful, multiply. And I'm thinking about the guy who, tried to make the dinosaurs come back to life and all of that. So without and he blessed them, where is an indication of love. And I say this with knowing what an amazingly magnificent world God created, but the idea that how is this different from saying, okay, I'm going to make this basically human natural park without the I bless them. Where is the relationship there? I don't know exactly what I'm asking. And so you could.
I maybe.
I can hold. You can table that until. Yeah.
Okay, I think or maybe someone else will understand it in a way that will be able to answer you more appropriately than me. No, Sydney, then Ben, then Bruce, then Merle.
Actually, Steve.
Actually, Steve's going to speak. Shabbat Shalom. I'm really thinking about the word us. Let us create. I'm sure there are many midrash. I was wondering.
We're going to look at some.
You are? Okay, because I was wondering what your favorite midrash might be about what us means.
Yes, we're going to look at one right after this.
Thank you.
Yep. Ben.
Thank you. Going back to what Jennifer was saying, I think I had a similar thought. So my thoughts were how the animals and such are sort of given this Darwinistic responsibility to multiply and have more, and a bit of survival of the fittest. The best that can survive will multiply more and more. That's, I guess, Darwinism. Where man, I say man, men and women, are given this secondary responsibility to prosper. And I expand that to say, because we men, we have these other abilities beyond Darwinism. We have great minds and strength, and to put teams together and make greater things. So man has a different responsibility to, of course, multiply, but also add great value to the earth, where the animals are to, prosper and multiply. I don't know if that sort of makes sense, or and that was
awesome. And that is one of the more optimistic readings of this idea of that humans should rule the fish of the sea and dominate. That it's not necessarily a domination in the sense of overwhelming and overpowering, but really to help the prospering of all these creatures.
Science.
Yeah.
Cure diseases and things.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, so let's look at one of these midrashim about this very curious question, which is, what is the us? Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. What's going on there? Why would God say us as opposed to let me? And so, because it's not like God speaks in third person all the time, or talks about other things that exist alongside him. So then we have this Mishnah from Sanhedrin. Therefore, Adam, the first man, was created alone to teach you. Maybe this is the one. I'll come back to this one. It's this one. Yes, this one. We'll go back to the other one. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, at the time that the Holy One, blessed be he, sought to create a person, he created one group of ministering angels. He said to them, if you agree, let us fashion a person in our image. And the angels said before him, Master of the universe, what are the actions of this person you suggest to create? And God said to them, his actions are such and such according to human nature. And the angels said before him, Master of the universe, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you think of him? In other words, a creature such as this is not worth creating, right? Think about, you want to create something based on human nature? Well, if you think about human nature, that's not something you really want to create. God outstretched his small finger among them and burned them with fire, destroyed these angels. And the same occurred with the second group of angels. Another second group of angels came along. God talks about what God wants to create. They say, are you sure you want to do this? And God smites them. The third group of angels that he asked said before him, Master of the universe, the first two groups who spoke their mind before you, what did they accomplish? The entire world is yours. Whatever you wish to do in your world, do. So, in other words, while those two other groups of angels kind of were trying to dissuade God, this third group of angels is saying, you're God. You can do whatever you want. Who are we to stop you from creating whatever you want to create? The entire world is yours. When history arrived at the time of the people of the generation of the flood and the people of the generation of the dispersion, in other words, the Tower of Babel, whose actions were ruinous, the angels said before God, so now later on, after all these bad things have happened on earth, Master of the universe, didn't the first set of angels speak appropriately before you, that human beings are not worthy of having been created? Now they're going back and saying, well, actually, those first group of angels, maybe they had something, maybe they knew what they were talking about. God said to them concerning humanity, even to your old age I am the same, and even to hoar hairs will I suffer you. I have made, and I will bear, and I will carry, and I will deliver you. From Isaiah. In other words, having created people, I will even suffer their flaws. What is going on here? What is this midrash trying to teach? There are a few different pieces here, right? Yeah, Merle? Oh, Merle froze.
Okay. So I feel like us is kind of like God's agenda to give us a guideline from the beginning. I mean, I think it's amazing that God, we really don't know God, but God is teaching us from the beginning as to what God's expectations are of us. And I think that as far as the angels having different opinions or changing their opinions, I think that is God influencing them on his or her, whoever God is, agenda on what God expects from the us, and that the angels are part of us. Nice. I could be way off base, but if I keep rereading this is what I'm coming up with.
Yeah, no, it's great. Thanks, Merle. Miriam? You're muted.
This is disturbing to me, Rabbi. This particular midrash, because showing God in the most contradictory way.
We're losing your audio.
Okay. It's showing God in a very contradictory, kind of negative light. So, as I said, this midrash disturbs me personally, because God is reacting in a way that we do not want humans to react. He decimates these angels for speaking their voices. He not only disagrees, but goes to the act of practically destroying them because they said something contrary to what he wanted to hear. So that is not a good value. That is not a positive thing to teach us. We don't want to emulate this part of God, and there are other parts of God we do want to emulate. So this personally disturbs me, which is good. Glad it does. Thank you.
Yeah, but Miriam, I want to challenge you then. So what's your take on the end of the story here, where after God, now this group of angels comes back to God and says, okay, now you created these creatures, these humans, they are doing insufferable damage to the world that you created, and what are you going to do about that? I mean, are you was it worthy to have created these things? And God responds by saying, well, basically, I created these creatures and I have to deal with the consequences, and I suffer the same flaws that they suffer as well. What is that? Is that God learning about God's self and changing?
I like that. I like that, and I didn't pay enough attention to it. So I'm glad that you made me look at that. Yes, I like it very much, because God is saying, as you said, I perhaps even have flaws, but these are the people I created, and therefore I will love them unconditionally with their flaws. So I like that. I like the way that ends for me.
Steve or Sydney, I don't know which one, and then Bruce.
You spoke earlier of creation being a continuous process, and I think that this passage is a part of that. I remember when I was in high school, I would think of the creation being like God's science fair project, working on creating the best creation, the best humankind that God could. And I think that God maybe smote the first two groups, because here I am again, says God, trying to make the best that I can, and just let me do it. And then later, well, maybe it is better than all those that came before. But here's what we have this time, and I did it. This is my entry into the science fair, and I'm with it.
Okay, nice. Bruce.
Okay, a question. What? How do the commentators on the idea that heavens and the earth, hello, first in order? It's the Jewish.
Say that again, Bruce, because you kept cutting out. Every other word came through, so it was a little hard to figure. Can you say it again?
Okay, I'll ask again. What is the take on the creation ex nihilo versus making order out of chaos as a definition for creation?
What's the you're asking what's the difference, or what are the commentary? What's the difference between?
Yes, what's the commentary?
Bruce, you ask very good questions, many of which I don't have answers to, but could if I spent a lot of time researching them. So yes, I'm sure there are some commentaries about, right, the idea of God creating from nothing, ex nihilo being the idea of God creating something from nothing, versus the idea of, what was the second idea you were contrasting that to?
Of bringing order out of chaos.
Oh, bringing order out of chaos. I do not know the answer. I'm sure there are some commentaries about that, and I think you bring up two very important ways in which where we can see this idea of creation, right? Is it from nothing? And I think there are definitely Kabbalistic interpretations and commentaries about that go into this idea of creation from nothing, and the idea of the Ein Sof, and the idea of nothingness, and the power of nothingness, and our attempt to get as close to that nothingness as we can, which we can't get very close to, and then this idea of chaos and order, which I think maybe you could look at maybe some commentaries that would look more from a historical context, similar to at the beginning of the conversation, where we are comparing and contrasting the Jewish creation narrative to other societies, and the idea of chaos versus peace, and some of the ways in which our tradition is trying to create kind of a more orderly fashion to the way in which creation occurs. So I know that's not a great answer, but you do have wonderful questions. So thank you. Jennifer?
Thank you.
Yes.
I'll try to be more coherent this time. Hey, so at first, like Miriam, I had trouble with this. Oh my gosh, the angels were told to speak up, and all they got was literally burned for it. But then upon rereading and reconsidering, I thought, well, perhaps, they're supposed to be angels. So, it reminds me of a sibling rivalry almost, and trying to get the other ones to not get the dessert, The other thing is perhaps it might have been also taken by God as, don't you know me better, that I would not have, as he concludes in the end, or this story concludes in the end, wouldn't you know me better, that I would tolerate their flaws and would not abandon them. So I'm sort of angry at you, and small finger, a gentle nudge.
Right, a gentle nudge. Yes, and I think it also is a way in which the rabbis are also commenting on kind of the complexity of God's character, because there are times in the Torah where God smites not just angels, but comes down with a heavy hand on the Jewish people and on the world, and other times where God seems to have a more compassionate side, right? And the idea of the 13 attributes of God, and this idea of even God, right? The midrash of God crying when the Egyptians are drowning in the sea, as the Israelites are crossing the sea, right? And this idea that the complexity of God's personality is even present at the very, very beginning when God decides. But interestingly enough, also in contrast to other creation narratives, God here, according to the rabbis, is willing to actually talk and converse with these angels to get their opinions. Now, of course, in this version, God destroys some of them, but there is an interesting thing here where there is dialogue, that God is even in dialogue and in conversation with the angels, whereas God could have just done it without any dialogue whatsoever and just made a decision. That the rabbis here seem to be suggesting this idea that this is a God who wants to be in relationship. Now, in the Midrash, it's relationship with the angels. Later on, as we find in the Torah, in relationship with humanity. And that in the very sense that we are created in God's image, is that built into who we are is a relationship with God, that there is an inherent relationship and connection to God in every single individual, just based on the way in which we are created. Which brings me, I want to make sure I get to this one, the Sanhedrin. This is a famous passage that is referenced in various times. So I want to share this with you, and then we can talk about this and any other questions before we have to wrap up. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, at the time that the Holy One, blessed be He, sought to create a person, He created one group of ministering angels. He said to them, if you agree, let us fashion a person in our image. And the angel said before him, Master of the universe, what are the actions of this person's... Did I just read this one? No. No, that's the one I read before. Sorry, oh my gosh, I'm really losing my mind here. Therefore, Adam, the first man, was created alone to teach you that with regard to anyone who destroys one soul from the Jewish people, aka kills one Jew, the verse ascribes him blame as if he destroyed an entire world, as Adam was one person from whom the population of an entire world came forth, right? This is a famous passage. You destroy one life, you destroy a world. And conversely, anyone who sustains one soul from the Jewish people, the verse ascribes him credit as if he sustained an entire world. So that anyone who saves a life, it's as if you have saved an entire world. That's a passage that's used a lot when it comes to the value of human life and the importance of trying to save a life. The Mishnah cites another reason Adam, the first man, was created alone. And this was done due to the importance of maintaining peace among people, so that one person will not say to another, my father is greater than your father. And it was also so that the heretics who believe in multiple gods will not say, there are many authorities in heaven and each created a different person. In other words, that this is also supposed to teach us, though it's referencing Adam here, but it's referring to the idea of the first humans that are created, that created alone and not in comparison with other people, so as not to lead to this idea of who is greater than others, which again relates back to other creation narratives where there is competition between the gods. But here, that God wanted to create a world in which we are not so focused on who is better than the other. And this serves to tell the greatness of the Holy One, blessed be He, as when a person stamps several coins with one seal, they are all similar to each other. But the Supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He, stamped all people with the seal of Adam, the first man, as all of them are his offspring, and not one of them is similar to another. Therefore, since all humanity descends from one person, each and every person is obligated to say, the world was created for me, as one person can be the source of all humanity and recognize the significance of his actions. Right? So we have in this one passage, famous passage of Sanhedrin, the idea that destroying a life is destroying a world, saving a life is saving a world, that we all were stamped uniquely by God, and therefore we all have our unique, yet we are all stamped by God. So God is a part of each of us, and yet each of us is unique in our character, and that therefore each of us has the potential to explore and discover our unique potential and power and role in the world itself, and that this is linked to the way in which we are created. Okay. Any thoughts, questions on any of this so far? No. Okay. We're getting towards the end, and I wanted to share. Okay, one more thing. We'll skip that. You have the sheet. You can read. This is just another midrash about how basically humans were created with some of the elements of angels and some of the elements of animals, and that we needed both, and therefore that we could both be from the lower world and from the upper world, and so that we can be linked to both elements, both heaven and earth. Okay, but I want to just end with a little focus on Rabbi Jonathan Sacks and some of his interpretation of this week's Torah portion. I love his teachings. Understood thus, Genesis 26 and 27, that's the one about God may we make God in our image, in the image of God, is not so much a metaphysical statement about the nature of the human person as it is a political protest against the very basis of hierarchical, class, or caste-based societies, whether in ancient or modern times. That is what makes it the most incendiary idea in the Torah. In some fundamental sense, we are all equal in dignity and ultimate worth, for we are all in God's image regardless of color, culture, or creed. A similar idea appears later in the Torah in relation to the Jewish people, when God invited them to become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. All nations in the ancient world had priests, but none was a kingdom of priests. All religions have holy individuals, but none claim that every one of their members is holy. This too took time to materialize. During the entire biblical era, there were hierarchies. There were priests and high priests, a holy elite. But after the destruction of the Second Temple, every prayer became a sacrifice, every leader of prayer a priest, and every synagogue a fragment of the temple. A profound egalitarianism is at work just below the surface of the Torah, and the rabbis knew it and lived it. This, as the Torah makes clear, was God's most fateful gift. Given freedom, humans misuse it. Adam and Eve disobey God's command. Cain murders Abel. By the end of the Parsha, we find ourselves in the world about to be destroyed by the flood, for it is filled with violence to the point where God regretted that he had ever created humanity. This is the central drama of Tanakh and of Judaism as a whole. Will we use our freedom to respect order or misuse it to create chaos? Again, back to chaos and order. Will we honor or dishonor the image of God that lives within the human heart and mind? These are not only ancient questions, they are as alive today as ever they were in the past. The question raised by serious thinkers ever since Nietzsche argued in favor of abandoning both God and the Judeo-Christian ethic is whether justice, human rights, and the unconditional dignity of the human person are capable of surviving on secular grounds alone. Nietzsche himself thought not. So really this transformative, revolutionary idea and the way in which not only the world is created, but the way in which we as humans are created, and that the teaching below the surface there about not only this idea of equality, but move away from hierarchy into this idea that if we are all to be kingdom of priests, as we learn in Exodus right around the time of Mount Sinai, that if every single person has the capacity to be a priest and to be a light unto the nations, then how are we going to make sure that just as God created light with words, that we use our words as well as our actions to bring about more order to the world, that we dominate not in the way that we see in a negative way of domination, to dominate the world and to overpower it, but instead to see domination as more as a caretaker role, that we have an extra responsibility. We were blessed by God with this extra blessing to care for the world in a way that can give us such honor. And are we going to do the right thing? And that the story that we have right here in creation is a constant reminder of that amazing opportunity that we have to bring beauty and blessing to the world through the words and through our actions. So with that, we are going to end. It is now 1:00, but thank you all
Thank you. That
Thank
was
you,
amazing.
Thank
Shabbat
you,
shalom.
Rabbi.
Shabbat shalom, Rabbi.
Thank you for all your
Shabbat
questions or
shalom.
comments. And I hope you have a wonderful Shabbat. And
Thank
I
you,
will.
Shabbat
I'll be back
shalom.
with you in a few weeks.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom,
Shabbat shalom,
everybody.
everyone.
Bye,
Shabbat
bye,
shalom.
Miriam.
Shabbat
Thanks
shalom.
for everything.
Can I say one thing, Rabbi? That it gives us a strong sense of belonging and identification and connectedness to think that tomorrow morning on Shabbat, Jews throughout the entire world, shuls, synagogues, temples, will all be reading Breshit at one moment.
Oh.
Beautiful.
Bye, Miriam. Bye, Miriam.
Beautiful.
Shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you.
Bye.
Meet you at Gracie.
Bye bye.